May 4th, 1945. 2:35 in the afternoon. The limestone cliffs of southern Okinawa shimmer in tropical heat that makes sweat pour from every pore. But Sergeant Bill Thompson feels cold as he studies the demolition calculations that will determine whether dozens of people live or die in the next 30 minutes. Thompson is a combat engineer trained in the mathematics of destruction. His job is to eliminate Japanese cave positions that threaten American advances across the bloodiest battlefield in the Pacific War. The calculations on his clipboard specify explosive charges, detonation depths, and blast patterns designed to collapse cave systems where enemy soldiers might be hiding. But something about today's numbers troubles him. The depth calculation for Cave Complex 7 shows charges placed at 15 feet below surface level. But Thompson's engineering training tells him that limestone caves in this geological formation typically extend much deeper. His measurements suggest the actual depth is closer to 30 feet, which means the explosive charges will detonate far above the cave floor, rather than within the chamber itself. Thompson faces a choice that will echo through decades. He can recalculate the charges and ensure that the explosives destroy everything inside the cave system. Or he can implement the demolition as specified, knowing that the depth error will cause the charges to explode harmlessly above whatever lies hidden in the darkness below. 30 feet beneath Thompson's position, Michiko Tanaka holds her 6-year-old daughter close to her chest and whispers prayers that she learned as a child in a Shinto temple that no longer exists. Around them, 43 other Okinawan civilians huddle in limestone darkness that has become their tomb or their salvation, depending on decisions being made by American soldiers who don't know they exist. Michiko's family fled to this cave system 3 weeks ago when American artillery began falling on their village like steel rain. Japanese soldiers had told the civilians that Americans would rape, torture, and kill anyone they captured. That death in the caves was preferable to surrender to foreign invaders who showed no mercy to Japanese people. The cave has become home to 17 families who brought children, grandparents, and whatever food they could carry into underground chambers carved by centuries of water flowing through limestone. They survive on rice that grows thinner each day, water collected from dripping stalactites, and hope that somehow they will outlive the battle raging above their heads. Michiko doesn't know that American engineers are preparing to collapse her hiding place with mathematical precision that should eliminate any possibility of survival. She doesn't know that her family's life depends on whether Sergeant Thompson chooses to correct a calculation error or allows it to stand uncorrected. Thompson stares at his calculations and makes the decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He implements the demolition as specified, with depth charges placed according to the erroneous measurements that will cause explosives to detonate 15 feet above the cave floor, rather than within the chamber where civilians are hiding. At 3:15, American explosives detonate in the limestone cliff with concussions that shake the earth and send dust cascading through underground passages. But the charges explode too high, creating surface craters and rockfall that partially blocks the cave entrance, without collapsing the underground chambers, where 44 people wait for death that doesn't come. Michiko feels the explosions through the stone around her, hears her daughter crying in the darkness, and realizes that they are still alive when they should be dead. The American demolition has failed to collapse their hiding place, creating debris that conceals the cave entrance without destroying the people inside it. In engineering, precision destroys. Combat engineers are trained to calculate explosive charges with mathematical accuracy that leaves nothing to chance. The difference between successful demolition and wasted explosives lies in measurements that must be exact because military effectiveness depends on technical precision. But sometimes, imprecision preserves. Sometimes, the calculation error that should compromise demolition effectiveness instead protects the lives of people who never knew they needed protection. Sometimes, the engineering mistake that wastes explosives becomes the mistake that saves families. The Battle of Okinawa had been raging for 5 weeks when Thompson made his decision to implement faulty demolition calculations. American forces were systematically clearing Japanese defensive positions in the most costly Pacific campaign, where every cave, every ridge, every village had been turned into a fortress that extracted maximum casualties from attacking forces. Cave warfare had become one of the most challenging aspects of the Okinawa campaign. Japanese defenders used the island's natural limestone formations to create underground positions that were virtually immune to conventional artillery and difficult to assault with infantry. American forces responded with specialized demolition techniques designed to collapse cave systems and eliminate defensive positions that could not be captured through direct assault. Thompson's role in cave-clearing operations required him to calculate explosive charges that would destroy underground positions without wasting ammunition or exposing American personnel to unnecessary risks. His work demanded mathematical precision, understanding of geological formations, and the ability to translate technical specifications into tactical results. The depth calculation error that Thompson discovered represented the kind of mistake that could compromise military effectiveness and endanger American lives. Incorrectly placed charges might fail to destroy enemy positions, leaving Japanese defenders intact to continue fighting from underground positions that American forces had assumed were neutralized. Under normal circumstances, Thompson would have corrected the error immediately and ensured that explosive charges were placed at the proper depth for maximum destructive effect. But something about Cave Complex 7 made him hesitate to implement demolition with perfect technical accuracy. The cave system showed no signs of military occupation. No weapons emplacements, no defensive preparations, no evidence of the kind of engineering work that characterized Japanese military positions. Intelligence reports suggested that the caves might contain civilian refugees rather than enemy soldiers, but military protocol required clearing all cave systems regardless of their probable occupancy. Thompson's decision to implement faulty calculations rather than correct them reflected his understanding that technical precision might cause civilian casualties that military necessity didn't require. The engineering error that would waste explosives might also preserve lives that had no military significance, but possessed human value that couldn't be calculated with mathematical formulas. Do you think Thompson understood that his demolition error would save the lives of 44 people who were hiding in darkness below his position? Do you think he realized that his engineering imprecision would become the most precise humanitarian act of his military service? The explosions that failed to collapse Cave Complex 7 created confusion for American forces, who expected the demolition to eliminate a potential threat to their advancing units. When reconnaissance teams investigated the blast site, they discovered that the cave entrance had been partially sealed by rockfall, but that the underground chambers remained intact. More importantly, they discovered evidence of civilian occupation. Food containers, clothing, makeshift bedding, and personal belongings that indicated families had been using the caves as shelter, rather than soldiers using them as fortified positions. The failed demolition had preserved not just underground chambers, but also the lives of people who had sought refuge from battle, rather than participating in it. The discovery of civilian refugees in Cave Complex 7 led to a revision of American cave-clearing procedures that emphasized investigation before demolition. Instead of automatically destroying all cave systems, American forces began using loudspeakers to encourage civilian surrender and conducting reconnaissance to determine occupancy before implementing explosive demolition. Thompson's engineering error had contributed to policy changes that would save additional civilian lives during the remainder of the Okinawa campaign. The calculation mistake that preserved one group of refugees had helped establish protocols that would protect other groups who were hiding in cave systems throughout the island. But Thompson never learned about the broader implications of his demolition error. He continued his duties as a combat engineer for the remainder of the campaign, calculating explosive charges with obsessive accuracy that virtually eliminated technical mistakes from his subsequent work. The precision that Thompson brought to later demolition operations was influenced by his memory of the calculation error that had failed to destroy Cave Complex 7. He never knew that his mistake had saved civilian lives, but he understood that engineering errors could have consequences beyond military effectiveness, and he developed checking procedures that ensured his calculations served their intended purposes. Michiko Tanaka and her fellow refugees remained in the cave system for 6 more days, surviving on diminishing food supplies and water that collected from limestone formations. The rockfall caused by Thompson's misdirected explosives had partially concealed the cave entrance, providing additional protection from discovery while making escape more difficult. On May 10th, American soldiers using loudspeakers to encourage civilian surrender finally convinced the refugees that they would be treated humanely if they emerged from hiding. Michiko was among the first to appear, carrying her daughter toward American positions while calling for other families to follow her into the daylight. The Americans who encountered the cave refugees were shocked by their condition. Weeks of underground survival had left them malnourished, dehydrated, and traumatized by the constant fear of discovery and death. But they were alive, preserved by an engineering error that had failed to collapse their hiding place when it should have been destroyed with technical precision. Thompson was among the engineers who helped evacuate civilians from Cave Complex 7, though he never understood that his calculation error had been responsible for their survival. He saw families emerging from underground chambers that his explosives should have collapsed, and he felt gratitude that his demolition had failed to achieve its intended destructive effect. The irony of Thompson's role in both the failed demolition and the successful rescue was lost on him at the time. He had calculated the charges that should have killed the refugees, but his engineering mistake had preserved them for rescue by the same military forces that had been prepared to destroy their hiding place. Michiko and her family were transferred to civilian refugee camps, where they received medical treatment, food, and shelter, while American forces completed their conquest of Okinawa. The cave that had been their tomb for 3 weeks became a memory of survival against impossible odds, preserved by mathematical errors that had served humanitarian purposes. After the war, Michiko returned to rebuild her village with other survivors who had endured the battle through hiding, flight, or simply extraordinary luck. She never learned about Thompson's calculation error or his decision to implement faulty demolition procedures, but she spent the rest of her life grateful for survival that had seemed impossible when explosions shook the earth around her underground refuge. Thompson returned to civilian life as a construction engineer, building bridges, roads, and buildings that connected communities rather than destroying them. His post-war career required the same mathematical precision that had characterized his military service, but with the goal of creating infrastructure that would serve peaceful purposes rather than military objectives. The irony of Thompson's transition from military to civilian engineering was that his peacetime work demanded exactly the kind of technical accuracy that he had deliberately compromised during the cave demolition that saved 44 lives. The precision that built bridges and highways was the same precision that could have collapsed underground chambers and killed families. Thompson never discussed his wartime service with his civilian colleagues or his family. The decisions he had made about demolition calculations belonged to a part of his life that seemed disconnected from the peaceful construction projects where he spent his post-war career. But sometimes when Thompson was reviewing structural calculations for a bridge foundation or a building support system, he would remember the morning when choosing not to correct an engineering error had been the most important decision of his military service. The calculation mistake that had failed to destroy a cave system had preserved lives that were more valuable than any structure he would ever build. The cave system where Michiko's family had hidden was eventually converted into a memorial site, honoring civilian victims of the Battle of Okinawa. The limestone chambers that had served as refuge were preserved as a reminder of the suffering that war inflicted on people who had no connection to military objectives or strategic goals. The memorial included exhibits about the cave warfare that had characterized the Okinawa campaign, emphasizing the human cost of military operations that turned natural formations into battlefields where families sought shelter from violence they had not created. Visitors could walk through underground passages where refugees had survived on hope and diminishing supplies while battles raged above their heads. The memorial didn't specifically mention Thompson's calculation error or his decision to implement faulty demolition procedures, but it included displays about American personnel who had made individual choices that preserved civilian lives rather than eliminating them. The exhibits illustrated how military operations could serve humanitarian purposes when individual soldiers chose mercy over mechanical efficiency. Thompson visited the memorial in 1989, 44 years after the demolition error that had saved 44 lives. He walked through cave passages where families had hidden from his explosives, understanding for the first time that his engineering mistake had preserved the underground chambers that visitors could now explore safely. The exhibit that affected Thompson most deeply was a display of personal belongings that refugees had carried into the caves during their underground exile. Children's toys, family photographs, rice bowls, and clothing that represented the human dimension of survival in conditions that should have been impossible to endure. Thompson left the memorial understanding that his calculation error had been part of something larger than individual technical competence. The engineering mistake that had failed to destroy Cave Complex 7 had become part of a story about human survival that transcended military effectiveness and demonstrated the value of life over precision. The story of the demolition error that saved cave refugees became part of the larger narrative about individual choice and historical outcomes during the Battle of Okinawa. Military historians recognized that the campaign had been shaped not just by strategic decisions and tactical operations, but also by the accumulation of small mistakes and personal choices that had determined whether civilian populations survived or perished. Thompson's calculation error entered this historical literature as an example of how technical mistakes could serve humanitarian purposes when engineering precision conflicted with human preservation. The demolition that failed to achieve its military objective had succeeded in preserving lives that were more valuable than any tactical advantage that cave destruction might have provided. But perhaps the most important aspect of Thompson's story was its illustration of how individual technical choices could have moral dimensions when the stakes involved human life rather than military effectiveness. The engineer who chose to implement calculation errors rather than correct them had demonstrated that even the most precise technical work could serve humanitarian purposes when individual conscience recognized the human significance of mathematical accuracy. The calculations that had failed to collapse Cave Complex 7 were eventually preserved in engineering archives as examples of how mathematical errors could have positive rather than negative consequences. The demolition formulas that had been intended to destroy underground chambers had instead become evidence of how technical precision could be subordinated to human preservation when individual choice aligned with humanitarian values. In the end, Thompson's story became a reminder that the most important engineering sometimes involves moral rather than mathematical calculations, and that the errors we choose not to correct can preserve more than the accuracy we achieve through technical precision. The demolition that failed to destroy a cave system had succeeded in preserving families whose survival was more valuable than any military objective that mathematical accuracy might have accomplished. If stories like this make you think about the hidden humanitarian dimensions of technical decisions, about the calculation errors we all might make, and the precision we sometimes choose to sacrifice for human values, about the mathematics that shapes life and death in ways we rarely recognize, then perhaps you understand why some mistakes are worth preserving, why some engineering errors are worth remembering, and why the most important calculations sometimes involve choosing mercy over mathematical accuracy.